The disturbing case of the man who lived in my walls. I used to live in a duplex outside of Philadelphia. It wasn't anything special, just a 2-bedroom unit with old creaky floors, thin walls, and the kind of basement you avoid unless absolutely necessary. I was 22, had just graduated from college, and this was my first time living alone. At first, I loved the quiet. No roommates, no one telling me what to do. But it didn't take long for the silence to become strange. Too silent. I started noticing little things. Items weren't where I left them. Food would go missing, just small things like a slice of bread or a yogurt. At first, I blamed myself. Maybe I was forgetful or tired. But then things got weirder. One night, I came home from my evening shift and noticed the living room window was cracked open. It was the middle of December. I never opened that window. The lock was broken, cleanly snapped in half. I was spooked but told myself it might have happened in the wind, maybe the window had been faulty. I started locking my bedroom door at night. I didn't want to admit I was scared, but something felt off. It was around that time I started hearing sounds, soft, muffled movements at night. The first few nights I wrote it off as old house noises. But then I heard a cough. A deep, unmistakable human cough. I froze. I was in bed. TV off. Heater silent. Everything was still. Except that cough. It came from inside the walls. I sat upright and stared at the drywall. I listened, holding my breath. Nothing. Just silence. The next day, I inspected every vent, every crack in the house. Nothing seemed unusual. Until I opened the attic. There was a small crawl space I had never explored. I pulled the ladder down and climbed up. It was dusty, cobwebbed, and smelled of mold. I scanned the small space with a flashlight. And then I saw it, piles of wrappers, half-eaten granola bars, a dirty blanket, and a backpack. Someone had been living up here. My stomach twisted. I grabbed the bag and ran downstairs. I didn't open it right away. I just locked myself in my room and tried to think. Who had been in my house? How long had they been there? When I finally opened the backpack, it got worse. There were photos inside. Of me. Hundreds of them. Most were taken from behind curtains, through vents, or from corners of rooms. Some were recent. I was wearing clothes I'd worn that week. One was taken from above, from the attic. I was asleep in my bed. There were also scraps of paper, notes scribbled in strange handwriting. Some were rambling nonsense, others were specific. She eats dinner at 6:30. Always chicken. She locks the bathroom door but not the closet. She cried last night. Why? I called the police. When they arrived, I handed over the bag, and they searched the house. Nothing. Whoever had been living in the attic was gone. They searched the neighborhood and asked neighbors. No one had seen anything unusual. They said it might have been a homeless squatter, that I was lucky nothing worse happened. I didn't feel lucky. I stayed with my parents for a few weeks, but eventually moved back in after installing cameras, stronger locks, and even motion sensors in the attic. And for a while, it was fine. Until the cameras started turning off. The footage would go black between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Every night. Just static. Then, like clockwork, they'd start working again. I called the security company. They couldn't explain it. No power outages, no interference. They sent someone to replace the system, but even the new one did the same thing. Then one night, I stayed up. I didn't sleep. I sat in bed, phone in hand, waiting for 2 a.m. At exactly 2:07, I heard it. A click. Then another. Then the unmistakable sound of a vent cover being removed. It was coming from the hallway. I stepped out of my room, holding a flashlight and a kitchen knife. My heart was beating so fast I thought I'd pass out. I crept toward the hallway vent. Nothing. The cover was in place. I leaned closer, listening. And then I heard breathing. I screamed and ran back to my room, slammed the door, and called 911. This time, the police took it more seriously. They brought dogs, tore open parts of the wall, searched the crawl spaces, and that's when they found it. Behind the drywall in the hallway was a hidden space. About 2 feet wide, enough for a person to move through if they were thin. It led from the attic, down the walls, and even connected to the basement. Inside that narrow space, they found a sleeping bag, a battery-powered lamp, food wrappers, and more photos of me. But the man was gone. They said he must have had an exit plan. That he knew the house better than I did. He had probably been living there for months, maybe longer. I moved out the next day. But the story doesn't end there. A month later, I got a call from the police. They found the man. He was squatting in an abandoned house not far from my old place. When they arrested him, he was incoherent, talking to himself, laughing. They found dozens of journals, all filled with writing about me. He believed we were meant to be together. That I had invited him in, spiritually. That the house was a vessel that connected our souls. They showed me his mugshot. I recognized him. He was the guy who delivered my groceries once. I remembered his face because he lingered too long at the door. He asked if I lived alone. Complimented my smile. I was polite, but uncomfortable. That was over a year ago. Apparently, he had been obsessed with me since then. He'd watched me, learned my routines, even applied to jobs nearby so he could stay close. He never hurt me, never touched me, but he watched everything. Every second. Even now, I can't be alone in a house. I sleep with lights on, check every vent, every closet, every ceiling tile. I see therapists, take medication, but nothing helps. Because the worst part isn't that someone lived in my walls. It's that for months. I spoke out loud in that house. I laughed, I cried, I lived my life. And someone was there, just behind the drywall, listening to everything. The end. Story 2. The Man in the Walls. It was late November when I moved into the duplex. It was old but cheap, with stained carpets, creaky stairs, and a faint smell of mildew that clung to the air no matter how many candles I burned. But I didn't care. I was 26, fresh out of a toxic breakup, and finally on my own for the first time in years. Independence felt like freedom, even if it came wrapped in cracked paint and flickering kitchen lights. The landlord, a quiet guy named Harold, told me the place had been vacant for a few years. Something about the last tenants breaking their lease early. He didn't say why, and I didn't ask. I should have. The first couple nights were uneventful. I unpacked, set up my little workspace in the upstairs room, and tried to settle into a routine. But by the third night, I started hearing things. At first, it was just subtle, faint tapping noises coming from inside the walls, almost like the sound of mice skittering through insulation. That wouldn't have surprised me. This place looked like it hadn't seen an exterminator in years. But then the tapping got louder. More deliberate. Rhythmic. Almost like knocking. I told myself it was the pipes or the old structure settling. That's what everyone says, right? Old houses make noise. But there was something off about it. It didn't sound like random creaking or plumbing. It sounded like someone trying to get my attention. The first real scare happened a week in. I was in bed scrolling through my phone, trying to fall asleep, when I heard a scratching noise above me. It was coming from the ceiling, right above where I lay. I paused, held my breath. The sound was slow, steady, like fingernails dragging across drywall. I jumped out of bed and stared at the ceiling, expecting to see some cracks or signs of rats, but there was nothing. Just a plain white ceiling and a cheap ceiling fan spinning lazily. The sound stopped when I stood up. That night, I barely slept. The next day, I asked my neighbor if they'd ever experienced weird noises. She was in her 40s, lived in the other half of the duplex, and mostly kept to herself. When I brought it up casually, she stiffened a little. "You're in Unit B, right?" she asked. I nodded. Her expression tightened. "The walls are thin. You'll hear stuff sometimes." I wouldn't worry. But her tone didn't match her words. It was like she knew something she wasn't saying. That evening, I inspected the house more closely. The walls, the vents, even the crawl space under the stairs. I didn't know what I was looking for, proof I wasn't going crazy, I guess. That's when I found something strange. Behind a loose panel in the upstairs hallway, I found a small cavity. It wasn't big, maybe 4 feet tall and a few feet wide. Just empty space between walls, but someone had been there. There were candy wrappers, an old flashlight, and a child's drawing pinned to the drywall with a thumbtack. The drawing was crude, done in black crayon. It showed a stick figure standing next to a bed, and another figure, inside the wall. No face. Just hollow black circles where the eyes should be. I stared at that drawing for a long time. Something about it chilled me deeper than the cold draft coming from that cavity. I put the panel back and tried to forget about it. But that night, the knocking returned. Only this time, it was louder. Closer. Like it was coming from inside my room. Over the next week, things escalated. I would hear footsteps at night, light, cautious footsteps pacing along the hallway when I knew I was alone. Objects started disappearing, a spoon from the sink, my charger, a pair of socks. Nothing major, but enough to notice. I started to feel watched all the time. Like there were eyes on me, hiding just out of sight. One night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of breathing. Heavy breathing. Raspy. Shallow. I lay frozen, my blanket pulled up to my chin, afraid to move. The sound was coming from the corner of the room, right by my closet. But when I turned on the light, there was nothing. I thought about calling the landlord, but what could I even say? Hey, I think there's someone living in my walls. I'd sound insane. Maybe I was going insane. That's when I decided to install a couple security cameras inside the house. One in my bedroom, one in the hallway, and one in the living room downstairs. I checked the footage the next morning, expecting nothing. I was wrong. At 3:12 a.m., the hallway camera caught movement. A man. Thin. Pale. Wearing torn clothes. He emerged from the hallway wall, literally pushed open a hidden panel, and stepped barefoot into the hallway. His movements were jerky, like someone who hadn't walked in a long time. He crept toward my bedroom door. Stood there, watching. Then, after nearly 5 minutes, he turned and walked back into the wall. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, mouth dry. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't an animal. It was a man. Living in my walls. I called the police immediately. Showed them the footage. They searched the place thoroughly and eventually discovered what I had missed, a narrow hidden corridor that ran between the walls of both units. It was only accessible through a small crawl space behind a false panel in the kitchen pantry. Inside, they found a nest of blankets, food wrappers, empty bottles, and dozens of Polaroids. Photos of me. Sleeping. Brushing my teeth. Sitting on the couch. Even using the bathroom. He had been watching me for weeks. The man was gone. Vanished. They never found him. But here's the part that still haunts me. One of the officers called me over while they were collecting evidence. He showed me one last Polaroid they found in a crack in the wall. It was a photo of me, lying in bed, taken from inside the wall. But in the bottom corner of the picture, barely visible, was a reflection of a face. Not the pale man. A different face. Older. Wrinkled. And smiling. Turns out, there had been rumors about the place for years. The last tenants moved out after their child started talking about a wall man who would whisper to them at night. The landlord denied everything. Said he had no idea. But something told me he knew. Maybe not the details, but something. I moved out the same day. But that wasn't the end. 2 weeks later, I got a call from my old neighbor. The woman in Unit A. She sounded shaken. "There's someone in my attic," she whispered. "I can hear him moving." I never answered her calls again. I didn't want to know. Because deep down, I already did. Some people believe in haunted houses. Some believe in ghosts. But sometimes, the most terrifying thing isn't supernatural at all. It's human. And it's hiding right behind your walls. Story 3: Disturbing case of living in someone's walls. I never thought something like this could happen to me. It's the kind of story you hear about on a true crime podcast or in a creepy Reddit post. But this was real. And it changed everything about how I see my home and the people around me. I had just moved into my new apartment. It was a small, one-bedroom unit in an old building on the outskirts of town. Not sketchy, but definitely not fancy. The rent was cheap, which should have been a red flag right from the start. But I needed a place, and fast. The landlord, an older man named Mr. Cleary, was quiet, polite, and didn't ask too many questions. He just handed me the keys, took my deposit, and told me to let him know if anything went wrong. It was perfect. At first. The first night was uneventful. The place was quiet, maybe a little too quiet. I chalked it up to being in a new environment. The walls were thin, the floor creaked a bit, and the pipes groaned like an old man trying to stand up. Nothing unusual. But by the third night, things started to feel off. It was around 2:30 a.m. I had fallen asleep on the couch watching TV when I heard something. A soft thump. Then another. Not loud, but definitely there. It was coming from behind the wall across from me, the one that divided my apartment from the empty unit next door. I paused the TV. Silence. Then came a scratching noise. Not like a mouse or something small. This was deliberate. Slow. Like someone dragging their nails along the inside of the wall. I stood up, heart pounding, and pressed my ear to the wall. Nothing. I didn't sleep much that night. Over the next few days, the noises became more frequent. I kept hearing soft knocks and scratches from different parts of the apartment, especially late at night. Once, I heard what sounded like muffled breathing behind my bedroom wall. I told myself it was just the building settling. Maybe rats. I even asked Mr. Cleary about it, and he shrugged it off. Old place. Pipes act up. You'll get used to it. But I didn't. Because things got worse. One morning, I woke up and found my kitchen chair moved from the table to the center of the room. I live alone. I don't drink. I hadn't touched that chair. A week later, I found my toothbrush wet, like it had just been used. I hadn't brushed yet. I tried convincing myself I was just being paranoid. Sleep deprived. Maybe I moved the chair and forgot. Maybe I accidentally turned on the faucet when I was half asleep. Maybe. Then I started to smell something. It started faint, like old meat or something rotting. It would come and go. I scrubbed the kitchen, took out the trash, even poured bleach down the drains. But the smell stayed. And always from the walls. One night, I had a friend over, Sarah. She's always been into creepy stuff, the kind of person who watches horror movies alone in the dark just for fun. I told her about the noises and the weird things happening. She laughed at first. "You probably have a squatter," she joked. I laughed too. Nervously. But then she got serious. "No, seriously. That's actually happened before. People living in walls, attics, crawl spaces. Hiding. Watching." She said it like a joke, but the way she looked at the walls after she said it, something in her expression shifted. Like she was starting to believe it, too. We ended up doing a kind of sweep of the apartment that night. Checking every cabinet, every closet. We knocked on the walls, pushed on them. Everything seemed solid. Normal. Until we got to the hall closet. There was a faint draft coming from the back panel of the closet, a square of plywood that didn't match the rest of the wall. Sarah tapped on it. It sounded hollow. We looked at each other. She grabbed a flashlight from her bag, and I got a hammer. With a few hard strikes, the panel came loose. Behind it was a dark, narrow crawl space. It was barely big enough to fit a person. It extended to the left, into the wall between my apartment and the one next door. And the smell, that rotting, sickly odor, was stronger now. Almost unbearable. Sarah shined the light into the space. At first, we didn't see anything. Just dust, cobwebs, and old insulation. Then we saw it. A pile of small objects, neatly arranged. Candy wrappers. Bottle caps. A single sock. A photograph of me sleeping, taken from the foot of my bed. I staggered back, nearly throwing up. Sarah looked pale. She didn't say anything. Just reached in and grabbed the photo. "This isn't funny," I whispered. "I don't think it's supposed to be." We called the cops immediately. When they arrived, they took the photo and checked out the crawl space. They said it was likely an old maintenance tunnel from when the building was first constructed. Not used in years. But someone had been using it. They found old food containers, a blanket, and even a journal, filled with scrawled handwriting that wasn't mine. Most of it was gibberish. Repeated phrases. Names I didn't recognize. And my name. Over and over. They didn't find anyone in the walls. But they said whoever had been there must have escaped through the other unit or one of the maintenance exits. They never caught them. I moved out 2 days later. But it doesn't end there. A month after I left, I got a call from Sarah. She was crying. Said she felt like someone was watching her in her new place. Things were going missing. Furniture moving. She found another photo of herself sleeping. Taken from inside her closet. She moved in with her parents the next day. The cops still haven't figured out who was in the walls. Some believe it was a homeless person using the old tunnels to sneak into apartments. Others think it was someone who lived in the building and just snapped. Maybe someone who used to live in that unit before me and never really left. But I have a theory. Whoever it was, they weren't homeless. They chose us. They watched us. They waited until we let our guard down. And then they came out. To this day, I can't sleep without checking every wall, closet, and vent in whatever place I'm staying in. I tape over air vents. I never leave my closet door open at night. And if I ever hear scratching in the walls again, I'm not going to wait around. Because now I know. Sometimes the thing that's haunting you isn't a ghost. It's a person. Living just inches away. Right behind your walls. Waiting.